Dave, you are a great proponent of consciousness being fundamental. What does that imply about the nature of the self? Consciousness and the self are not the same thing.
Yeah, I've always been confused about the self, to be honest, and I don't have settled views about it. It's very natural to say that the properties of consciousness all attach to a self, a kind of persisting entity that's fundamental to our nature. And if, like me, you think that consciousness is a fundamental property of the world, it's natural to think it attaches to a fundamental entity, the self. All the same, we've got direct evidence of consciousness. I take consciousness to be a datum. I don't take the self to be a datum. If I introspect, I immediately find states of consciousness. But as David Hume said, I don't immediately find a self. So the inference to the self to me is more kind of a bit of theory, or at least optional. So it's attractive, if you see consciousness as fundamental, to think there might be a fundamental self. But at the same time, there's all kinds of problems here. Like, for example, if I divide or I change over time, or I upload my brain and so on, then what happens to the self? It looks like there's going to be cases where it's hard to see what happens. So I at least entertain the idea of being a bit deflationary about the self, saying, yeah, consciousness is fundamental, but the self is not.
So let's just take the two views extant now. That consciousness is fundamental, as you and an increasing number of people believe, and then the traditional belief, at least over the last century, the traditional scientific view that consciousness is just derivative, it's emergent from the brain in ways that we understand some and not all. So those two views. So in each of those two, what would be the implications for the self? Would the self be a stronger entity if indeed you are right and consciousness is fundamental?
So if you're a reductionist, you're going to say both consciousness and the self are derivative, non-fundamental things. That's the materialist view. Then there's the property dualist view that says consciousness is a fundamental property. And then there's the substance dualist view that says consciousness is a fundamental property and it's had by a fundamental entity, the self. I divide my credence between those two latter views. I think it's possible to be a property dualist and still say the self is not fundamental. Here's one way you could do it. You could be a panpsychist and think consciousness exists at the fundamental level. The fundamental things that have consciousness are things at the level of particles, quarks and photons and so on. Somehow all those combine to yield systems like me, whose consciousness is a combination of those things as well. If that's the case, then myself, I will be a complex entity, a combination of all those underlying simple panpsychist entities, but I'll still have this fundamental property of consciousness.
So in that case, the consciousness would be fundamental, but the self would be a composite.
Exactly. Well, consciousness itself would be fundamental. Now, my little colloquy here, my consciousness on that view might be non-fundamental, because my consciousness would derive from fundamental consciousness at the level of the atoms.
Right.
Likewise, myself would derive from maybe fundamental selves at the level of atoms. So in some sense, it would be fundamental self and fundamental consciousness at the bottom level, somehow adding up to non-fundamental self and non-fundamental consciousness at this level.
Wait. I got you. I got your the fundamental consciousness combining up, composing into your non-fundamental consciousness, which is Dave Chalmers. But how do you now get the self? How does the self relate to that, to your consciousness? Is the self just a linguistic construct, or is there something substantively different about a self that has consciousness? Can you have a self without consciousness, and can you have consciousness without a self?
These are great questions, and to me, the whole idea of consciousness suggests a subject having the consciousness. What is consciousness? It's what it's like to be a given entity or a given system. You need a system such that there's something it's like to be it. So that suggests there has to be a subject. It doesn't yet tell you anything about whether that subject is fundamental. Every now and then, though, the Buddhists entertain the idea, for example, of there being a consciousness without a subject, without any kind of self that persists. And the question is, can you really make sense of that? And I have moments when I think I can make sense of this. Consciousness is this process, this amazing thing that part of, there's a stream, there's a flux of consciousness. And does it really need this entity, a self at the middle? You might hold that this talk of a self is really just derivative for elements of that flux.
But are you defining self as the subject of consciousness?
I guess so, yeah. There are different ways of thinking about the self where it's not so tied to consciousness. There's a body here, there's someone who persists even when I'm asleep and I'm not conscious, and so on. But I guess the notion of self I'm especially interested in is the subject of consciousness.
And the self being the subject of consciousness is a quality that would not just apply to humans or higher animals. It could be very pervasive. So in your definition, if a paramecium or a flatworm has some element of consciousness, it would have, being the subject of consciousness, it would have some element of selfhood.
I think that's right. What it would have, if a paramecium is conscious, then it is by definition, in my view, a subject of consciousness. What it won't have necessarily is self-consciousness. It won't necessarily be conscious of itself. I could be conscious of you and conscious of the world and so on without being conscious of myself. It may be that, for example, self-consciousness is the domain of relatively complex creatures like ourselves, whereas simple consciousness can go down into much simpler creatures than us.
Right, but what do you gain at that level by defining self as the subject of consciousness? Is that just a name put on that definition, subject of consciousness? You could put any name. You could say, it's a horse.
You can call it Joe if you want. Yeah.
Right.
For me, that's what I'm interested in. What is the subject of consciousness? And that's what I'm calling the self. Call it something else if you like.